Dr. Jude Benavides is an associate professor of hydrology and environmental sciences in the School of Earth, Environmental and Marine Sciences at UTRGV. He is also a member on the board of the Southmost Regional Water Authority. Dr. Benavides, thank you for taking my call today.
Sure, absolutely.
Just very generally, tell us, what is your research about in water resource management here in South Texas?
My area of expertise is in hydrology. I am a hydrologist with a background in civil and environmental engineering. That's given me a broad base of knowledge with respect to water resources. I have two varied specialties in there. One is flooding and flood modeling and prediction, and the other one is long-term water resource management, particularly as it relates to the environment. But because of my civil engineering background, I also do a lot of work with water supply for municipalities. And so I'm originally from the Valley. I left for 18 years. I have an appreciation for the various water resource challenges that happen in this part of the world, in this part of the country. So,
when you say that you work with water municipalities, you're talking about cities here in the Rio Grande Valley, in northern Mexico?
Yes, absolutely. I don't work often directly with them, but I do a lot of studies on long-term rainfall patterns, on water storage, and the effect that those types of changing patterns that we experience here normally, and that could be exacerbated by climate change, have on both the environment and the human infrastructure.
As we know, we're in the middle of a major drought that has caused a water crisis across the American West and even south of the Rio Grande Valley into northern Mexico. And of course, other parts of the world. I saw some reports this morning on, the ongoing water crisis in Italy, the ongoing water crisis in the Horn of Africa. Here in this region, South Texas, North Tamaulipas, Monterrey still has access to running water only a few hours a day. People in San Antonio have been dealing with water restrictions, and just yesterday, Reynosa's Water Commission, COMAPA, said that the entire city will be without water for up to 48 hours, starting on Wednesday night. For people who are just coming into this, very generally, very broadly, for our own region, what are some of the reasons that we're in this situation today?
That's really the old $20,000 question, right? We are, as scientists, we are always hard-pressed to say exactly what a reason is, because I'm going to be honest with you, scientifically, we don't know. We do know that this part of Texas, the central, when I'm talking about central, latitudinal, so basically from here to San Antonio to Dallas, and west, and the same for Mexico as far as northern Mexico and west, is an area that is historically varied with respect to periods of rainfall and periods of drought. In other words, it is not unusual for us to swing away from our average annual rainfall amounts very low, in fact, almost half of what we would normally get for a year or two. And then sometimes we swing the other way and get double what we would normally get for a year or two. These patterns are very difficult to predict. We think potentially or possibly that this is tied to the persistent La Nina that we have in the Pacific, the Southern Oscillation, the El Nino-La Nina Southern Oscillation cycle has been uncharacteristically long in the La Nina period, and that tends to result in very dry patterns for our area. That could be one reason. The other reason could just be happenstance. In other words, we are with other cycles that we have not observed or have not yet become aware of throughout the planet, that we just happen to be in a dry period. On top of all of that, you have the potential for climate change interaction and, of course, exacerbating or making the problem worse. My guess is it's probably a combination of all of those three factors, along with increased demand that comes from growing population in this region.
And that would include the 5 million people in Monterrey as well, I imagine.
Absolutely. And if you, to discuss a little bit about the watershed that we are in, it's important for folks to understand that the Rio Grande watershed, particularly the lower, but the entire watershed, is amongst one of the most water-challenged and water-scarce watersheds, water-stressed watersheds in the world. There's a metric or measurement that hydrologists use, basically the amount of cubic meters. All right, so you basically take 3 feet, a little bit more than 3 feet, and make a cube that big. How many cubic meters of water does a person have per year renewable from nature? And if you're above 1,700 of those per person per year, you're water okay. In other words, you could be considered water rich. If you're between 1,000 and 1,700, you're water stressed. If you're below 1,000, you're what we call water scarce. And we, as on average, over the last 30 to 40 years, scientists, this is not my work directly, but what I have read and others have done and looked at, we have a number that sits around 500 to 700. So we're well below the threshold for water scarcity in this watershed. That is the long-term average, by the way. That is not a, hey, we're in a drought, things are bad, which means that when we get a drought, we become even more water scarce. And so it is very important that we understand that our watershed and our river is nothing like the Amazon, nothing like the Mississippi, nothing like the rivers of the world that have a vast amount of constantly flowing water. The Rio Grande is historically known for being bravo, the Rio Bravo, meaning often very, very low flow for prolonged periods of time, and then suddenly flashing flood for a short amount of time, and then going back down. We rely on that water for a large percent, on that river for a large percentage of our drinking water and our environmental water. And because of that, the challenges are going to grow, regardless of what climate change does, simply because of our increased population growth, increased demand, and the different type of water demand that this sector is exhibiting, meaning that we are shifting from an agricultural sector here in the valley to more of an urban industrial sector. And when that happens, you probably wind up using a little bit less water, which is a good thing because agriculture demands quite a bit of water, but that water must be treated for drinking purposes, and that adds cost. So, in a nutshell, we've got some significant challenges ahead, and that's one of the primary reasons that I, and along with other environmental scientists, civil engineers, environmental engineers, and academics are coming to UTRGV and looking and partnering with UTRGV to continue our research on this pressing topic.
Wow. So we can definitely say that this is part of the natural ebb and flow. We can also say it's an expected part of changes in water usage broadly. But we're also seeing reports of things like it's totally dried up through Albuquerque for the first time in decades. Are there some signs that this is maybe outside of what we have usually seen? And where might it go from there?
That's always possible. But again, as a scientist, I have to say, I often come across folks that say, hey, this has never happened before. That's an anecdotal observation, number one. I'm not saying it's not true. Definitely not saying it's not true. It has to be fact-checked, but it also has to be put in perspective. Historically speaking, droughts like this that are suddenly very, very hard, that come across all of a sudden that are very, very hard and very intense, tend to not be as long, fortunately. However, again, the odds of having an intense drought for a long period of time are smaller, but they can happen. And we're just getting into this cycle again. Again, the La Nina cycle has been around for a while. We didn't see the persistent drought pattern that typically comes for that for a short La Nina cycle. But now a triple La Nina or a triple threat, in other words, a third-year cycle of this kind of pattern, I think we're seeing a natural response to that. And we're finally starting to see the harsh effects. Hopefully this La Nina cycle will go away. We'll come out of this dry cycle within the next few months. And, you hate to hope for a hurricane, but maybe a baby tropical storm to come our way. We need a wetting storm that from the Gulf of Mexico. And that really, truly is, historically speaking, our lifeblood. We see evidence of that in the biology. We see evidence of that in the ecosystems. We see evidence of that in the sediment and soil patterns that, occasionally these storms do come through and they provide us with sustainable water supply. So along with a curse with their high winds and their floods, they are a blessing in that they do bring needed tropical moisture to an area, especially the eastern side of the valley, especially the western side of the valley and northeastern Mexico around Monterrey, that would characteristically be much more desert-like than semi-arid or subtropical without that coastal influence.
But just to clarify, we are today in a situation where this drought could reverse. It could get better.
Yeah, again, that's speculation on my part. There's no way really. I mean, all we can look at is long-term forecasts and seeing what these trends are. And that is any scientist, I'm not a climatologist, but any climatological scientist that will tell you how uncertain that is. But I do like to remind folks, as I do my students all the time, just because scientists aren't right or correct 100% of the time doesn't mean that their data or their opinions are wrong 100% of the time. Science is not a black or white yes or no type of endeavor, and this is something that we are continually gathering data. We're learning a lot more about the situation, but climatology and mid-range weather forecasts are exceptionally difficult, even for the great computational power and everything we've learned over the last 150 to 200 years. We still got a long way to go to be able to predict exactly what's going to happen. It's just not in the nature of that type of science. And I know people get frustrated by that, but that's just the harsh reality.
And so we've seen water shortages, we've seen water restrictions. What are maybe some far-reaching effects of this in the mid to long term that many of us may not realize could happen as a result of such a severe drought? I mean, maybe even just ecologically around us.
Yeah, if the long range climatological models are all over the place for us, but they mostly say that we're going to remain about the same, maybe slightly drier. So I think what's more important is the fact that as we get more and more people here and we become more and more urbanized, and for the agriculture that will remain, and I'm talking 50 years to 100 years from now, we must start focusing our efforts on conservation and sustainability. We have to be able to do more with less. The biggest thing is we have to acknowledge that we are not a region that is blessed with a long-term, steady, reliable source of water. And to pretend or acknowledge or try to pretend that we're not is problematic. That being said, I do not wish to discourage anyone from coming here, from industry from coming here. There is a reliable source of water long term. We are growing our sources of water with respect to desalination from both ocean water and brackish groundwater. And we are rapidly looking to implement ways to do more with less. I'm the chairperson of the Southmost Regional Water Authority. I have the good fortune of serving as a board member on the Brownsville Public Utility Board. And the SRWA, the Southmost Regional Water Authority, has the state's second largest brackish groundwater desalination plant. As a result of this drought, we are looking at expanding, hopefully, we're going to be asking, for expanding those resources and tapping more into groundwater and relying a little bit less on river water. Our groundwater here, unfortunately, is salty, which means we have to put a little bit more energy into it to desalinate it, and that means it's going to be a little bit more expensive to use compared to other groundwater. However, moderately expensive water is better than no water. So I think the long-term impacts are we're going to have to look at conservation, sustainability, and most importantly, we're going to have to look at pricing water in a correct fashion. Meaning that we're going to have to discourage and make sure that folks that do not acknowledge the fact that everybody needs to start to conserve water, is going to have to pay a little bit more. And if you use double or triple what your neighbor does, you need to pay more than double or triple. Again, I'm not a politician, so I can say this harsh reality, but that's what I envision. My kids are 7 and 5, soon to be 7 and 6. I think if they stay here, they're going to be growing up in that type of world. And we are not the only ones on the planet that are facing this. This is not a Brownsville thing, a Matamoros thing, a border thing. As you said, there are people around the world, particularly in Europe and other places, that are experiencing significant heat waves, significant droughts. And the fear is that climate change will make those things worse. I'm not saying that is going to happen, but regardless of whether it happens or not, we need to prepare for that worst case scenario as soon as possible.
Right. It sounds like a very serious challenge for the region, and it sounds like there's already quite a bit of approaches to managing this situation. Now, I don't know if you've seen the story that ran this week. Armed men have started hijacking shipments of water in Mexico on the highway that runs south of Reynosa to Monterrey. Now, you study hydrology, you're a scientist, but what can you say about what we might expect to see happen maybe in South Texas, northern Mexico, legally, economically, socially, if water continues to become more scarce?
Yeah, you're right. That's really out of my area, but I do work with folks that, social scientists and policy folks a lot. And I am a student of history. I think it was Mark Twain who said, whiskey is for drinking, water is for fighting. And that quote, over 150 years old now, or 100 plus years old, I forget, was born of the spirit of the Western United States. So, history repeats itself with regards to that. I often get questions from people saying, hey, when's the first water war we're going to have? We've had water wars, water battles, and culture wars based off of from water since we were around. In fact, the word river comes from the word rivalis, rival. Which means that folks on the other side of the river are not necessarily part of your tribe or part of your people, and that's not true here in the valley, because we are united in many more ways than we are divided by the river and the border still. But the bottom line is, you can live several months without food. You only can live a few minutes without air, and you can only live a few days without water. And air is a common property. It's around us everywhere. Nobody can yet control air. But when somebody feels that their water is being controlled, being wrongly taken, or it's reached a scarcity point where they need to turn to violence, that has happened countless times in our history of humanity, and will happen again. So I'm sad to see it happening, of course, and I think we need to address it. But any water scientist or historian is going to tell you that's no big surprise. And again, that's what I'm talking about as far as perspective. Saying, my gosh, things are so bad that we have water bandits. We've had water bandits in the Colorado River in the United States. We have water bandits in the Rio Grande time immemorial. Mm-hmm. And again, the very root word of the river, the term river, pays tribute to that unfortunate necessity that raises its ugly head from time to time.
Before we get off this call, what am I forgetting to ask? And I think we've covered a lot here.
I do think that one comment that is. We do have new technologies in this area that are being implemented, but there is a significant amount of more work that needs to be done with that, and particularly at the housing level. I've worked with a lot of folks that work in housing, and unfortunately, because of our economic situation here in South Texas, and because of the ongoing trouble with the pandemic and right now inflation, building practices and paying for more efficient processes with respect to energy and water are not on people's minds right now, and I don't blame them. They're worried about, keeping, food on the table and paying their bills. So, I hate to be that person that says, hey, we've got to think about this too. But, both of these situations are going to pass. This is not a permanent situation. And when we get that next respite, that time where we're allowed to come up and take a breath of air, we have to displace our short-term memory, and we have to think about, we cannot forget these challenges that we're going through this, and we have to really dive into our wallets a little bit for long-term sustainability. I always tell people, you get the infrastructure you're willing to pay for, and that's a reality. And if we don't have the money here, then we need to start collaborating with partners, asking for aid, and seeking those types of people, and encouraging our young folks to bring their new ideas, their new spirit and energy to the table boldly, and say, why not this? Because who knows? Who knows who's the next great scientist or great economist is going to come out from there and say, I think I've got a solution no one else has ever thought of, or I think I've got a great way to implement an engineering idea in a much more cost-effective fashion. If we can do it with space and SpaceX, and we've done it with lots of different areas in the past, in medicine and others, we can do it in water.
Dr. Jude Benavides, thank you so much for your time today. We'll definitely keep in touch on this topic as this continues to develop.
All right, great. I look forward to it, and let's hope for the best.